Hello lovely people, and welcome back to my channel, the Art Hive, with me Sarah. And in this week's video I'm going to show you how I drew this watercolour rose. All the items that I used will be in the description box, so go and check them out if you want to have a look. But this is the first time that I'm using the Archer's watercolour paper, and I'm using the hot press version, so I'm going to let you know what I think of this paper. I've only bought the small block because it is quite expensive, so I wanted to try it out first to see what I think before I buy any more. So why have I drawn a rose? Well, as you know, and if you've seen in my other videos, you'll know that I usually choose to draw animals. So this was a bit out of my comfort zone, but being that it has been so wet, rainy and dreary in the UK lately, I thought I would draw a rose because, especially with the water droplets, it was something that looked really pretty when wet, unlike everything else around here is just looking really grey, muddy and horrible. So it was a bit of a challenge, but I like a challenge. So to start with, I did an outline sketch, and rather than using graphite pencil for the outline sketch, I used the Prismacolor col-erase pencils. So the idea was that I wouldn't end up having that graphite pencil layer underneath, and because it was something that I wasn't familiar with, the reference photo helped me to place all the different structures of the rose, but it wasn't something that I felt that I could do with a really light pencil sketch. So the col-erase pencil was really good at showing me those areas, and I could kind of keep it a bit more visible rather than having it rubbed out and barely being able to see it. So the aim for doing this was to end up with a realistic rose with some nice water droplets on it, and once I'd sketched out the main areas with the water droplets, as you can see, I started to go in sections. So I just filled in different sections at a time, and the paintbrush I was using was really good for this because it had a nice fine point and was able to get in some really nice details and edges to those petals. I also used the Pentel Aquabrush as well, because I found that again with a nice fine point you were able to get into all that detail in the centre of the rose particularly. So one thing that you'll notice I didn't do to start with was I didn't mask out any areas where the water droplets were, to start with at least, because my aim was to try and lift those off while the watercolour paint was still wet, and that did work to start with, because certainly towards the centre of the rose there weren't that many water droplets, so it was fairly easy whilst that paint was still wet to just lift off small areas that I was going to put detail in later. But this did become progressively harder and harder as I worked outwards towards the outside edges of the rose, because not only did I have a lot more water droplets, but a lot of them were really fine, and I did start to struggle to lift off that paint in all those areas while still concentrating on getting the colour that I wanted, the shading that I wanted, and all the details in the right place. But I persevered for a while, probably longer than I should have done, and tried various different things to try and lift off really tiny areas that were going to be where those water droplets were. So if there's anyone out there who's got any tips on being able to do this without masking fluid, then do drop me a comment in the box below, because I did get to the point about here where I started to realise that it wasn't going to be working too well. I think I tried things like tissue and cotton wool and lots of things like that to try and lift off those areas before it dried, but it did start to prove difficult, and I did lose quite a bit of the detail that I'd hoped to preserve. But anyway, water droplets aside, I did find that it was quite good to lay down a layer of colour and then lift up some of the colour towards the centre of each petal where it was going to be lighter, and then add in details whilst the paint was still wet, and add in some darker colours where those petals overlapped and where there would be areas of shading. Something else that I also try to do as well, because if you look at a rose closely, oh, here's the masking fluid. I gave up in the end and decided to add some masking fluid. But something else that I did want to try and get across in my painting was that there are small lines on each petal, some sort of like veins in the petals themselves, and I wanted to try and get a little bit of an impression of those as well. So by adding the masking fluid, it actually helped me to concentrate on all the things that I wanted to do on each petal, rather than having to worry about going around the water droplets and concentrating on the right colour, the right shading and the right texture to the leaf. So adding the masking fluid was a really good idea, and probably should have done it in the first place, but you live and learn, and that's something that I can take on for next time. So as you'll see then, the whole process of painting this rose did then speed up quite a bit, because as I said, I was able to concentrate on doing the colours that I wanted, getting the detail in, and it's about now that I come in, as you can see, with a really fine paintbrush, and whilst the paint is still wet, just give the impression of some of those veins or lines on the petals themselves, just to help it make it look a little bit more realistic. So the good thing about watercolour is as well that you can add many different layers on top. So whilst I was doing the outside leaves and the inside leaves were drying, I could then, once they were dry, go back and add some darker areas towards the centre to help it make it look more realistic, and yeah, just kind of really add some contrast to the rose itself. So you had some really nice dark areas into the centre of the rose, and contrasting with some lighter areas on the middle of those petals where the light would hit. The other thing with watercolour is that it does dry quite a bit lighter, so after it had dried, I did find that I needed to go in again several times just to try and get that contrast across, and I probably actually, when I look at the finished piece, could have done some darker areas as well, so some even darker areas, as I should say, but generally I was quite pleased with how it turned out, and for a first effort I thought it wasn't a bad attempt. And the best bit for me was actually removing that masking fluid and then working on the water droplets, because I really enjoyed this and they were really easy to do. I did notice that obviously the water droplets themselves aren't completely white, so I went in with a little diluted version of the same colour I used for the petals, and then with a really fine brush kind of outlined them under the darker area of each water droplet to make them kind of stand out and look like they were sitting on the leaf. And I thought that was really effective, and I was really pleased that I'd gone and done the masking fluid, because it meant that I hadn't lost all the water droplets that I'd wanted to be on the petals, as I had a bit at the start. You'll also notice that I haven't done a background with this piece, but my main aim was just to have a go, and really I was more focused on drawing the rose itself, getting the structure right, getting it to look realistic, and I didn't really envisage it to be sort of like a big wall hanging piece. It was more like a little practice go and trying it out to see if it's something that I would perhaps do a larger picture of with a background, maybe at some stage later on. So once I'd done the water droplets, I then just went in and with this fine paintbrush did a few more details, darkening up certain areas and adding a few more finishing touches. So making sure that I got some really dark areas compared to my really light areas, and as I said, I think I probably could have gone darker in certain areas just to add some more contrast. Something that I could have done to add some more contrast was to go in at the end with some colour pencils, as I've done in the past, but I didn't choose to do this because I decided that it looked quite fresh and clean as it was, and I didn't really want to go in with any more detail or colour. What I did do was to add some neutral tint, which is another watercolour paint, but this one's by Schminky, and that just kind of added another hue to it, and I was quite pleased with that and how it turned out in the end. The other thing that I was going to mention was my feelings on this paper. So very briefly, I was really pleased with it. I really liked how the paint laid down on this paper. It was really smooth, and no doubt if you'd wanted to add any media on top, that would have been great for that, but I definitely would recommend it, and I'm looking forward to using it again. So if you like this video, don't forget to give it a like, comment and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next week. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.